Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are today. Thank you, Sandra and the GBBC team for hosting this session. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Alissa Worley, and I am the Global Marketing Lead for Accenture Security. And we're here today to speak about something you might have heard about. I'm not sure if anybody's even talking about this yet, but it's the Metaverse and enterprise. It's a topic that has captured everyone's imagination, from government officials to tech enthusiasts to gamers to enterprise leaders. So what exactly is it? I ask myself that regularly, but at a high level, it's a collection of shared spaces that will create a whole new way of communicating and engaging. It's going to reinvent not only what, but how we buy. That's a big change that we're seeing in how we engage in a digital environment. It will open up new revenue streams for enterprises and change processes with things like digital twins. And it will change how we express ourselves. Like me as a marketer, I think about this stuff all the time when we think about how we're engaging with people. But we've seen kind of a shift over the course of time on how we express ourselves and how we show up in the digital world, how we engage in building what we've already created with the existing internet, social media and gaming networks, and the digital lives that we kind of have on our mobile devices. So with endless opportunities to deliver a more inclusive, sustainable, and collaborative environment and environments going forward, the potential of the metaverse is really just beginning to come into focus. And yet, as with all significant new innovations that are ultimately ubiquitous, it feels like there are more questions than answers. So thankfully, today, I have two experts here with me to kind of help me talk through this. So my good friend Yorke, I am coming to you first. I just scratched the surface on what we're talking about here today with Metaverse, and particularly in the context of enterprise. So can you expand upon this definition a little bit, particularly from the enterprise-centric perspective, like we just talked about, in the context of your work in the space, and how is Microsoft looking at the Metaverse?
So I think your definition is broadly correct. Metaverses, I like to say, are, well, the metaverse or metaverses, right, will depict themselves in various ways. Brands will come into the metaverse based on assets that they have that they can lean on. I've certainly seen that with Facebook's rebranding into Meta, and how they think about the world from a Oculus lens, so to speak. Is a very specific version how they sort of interpret what the metaverse is. But I think, from a digital presence perspective, the way I think about metaverse is it is many things, right? It is those types of rich VR and AR experiences. It is as simplistic as what feels very much like a 2D experience in Zoom or Microsoft Teams or other products like this. But the reality is it's just the way we experience each other in a digital realm. And that's broad definition actually gives a lot of permission for different interpretations of what that actually ultimately is.
Mance, I'm coming to you next. Same question. So how is Hedera considering some of the opportunities available to enterprises, and how is enterprise metaverse different from the metaverse? But if you could also kind of address again, expand on that definition, talk a little bit about what your work is in the space and what Hedera is doing here specifically.
Sure. Well, thank you. So just to start, I guess, for those that are unaware, Hedera Hashgraph is a distributed ledger public network that is governed by 25 of the world's largest enterprises, companies like Google and IBM and Boeing and Nomura and Shinhan Bank and on and on and on, globally cross-sector, decentralized, distributed governing body that represents the full range of use cases that enterprises might care about. And it's a next generation, third generation public DLT. And so we have an interesting perspective on the question of it's built for enterprise, governed by enterprise. And so we have an interesting perspective. When it comes to the metaverse itself, I think you did a great job in your opening remarks. I think of shared worlds or shared spaces as, in many cases, I think of them uniquely as peer-to-peer networks as opposed to centralized networks, although I'm sure that some would include centralized networks in the broader definition of metaverse. In these peer-to-peer networks, it allows people to work together, to play together, to exchange goods and services with one another without the need for a trusted third party that manages all of those interactions or has control over the information that is associated with whatever that shared world might be concerned with, right? And so it's a fundamentally different approach to interacting with one another without the need for trust of a third party not to damage you in some way. Now, the metaverse really has become prominent in recent months because of the new UI focus, right? When we think about metaverse, nearly everyone thinks about virtual reality or augmented reality. And while that is certainly a prominent part of the metaverse, but it's just another user interface into the metaverse that has already been being created now for more than a decade. And a lot of the underlying technologies that enable this vision that we're sort of describing predate any notion of using VR or alternative user interfaces into this space, into this new world of Web 3.0, as you might call it. And then, of course, there are a lot of enterprise use cases which we can dive into as appropriate here.
So you spoke a lot about the fact that we're really building on things that already exist. So it sounds like metaverse is something that is like, oh, it's something cool and new and different. But the reality is we're really just building on things that have already existed. And so, for example, you brought up XR. And I'm stealing liberally from Dave Treat, who leads our tech incubation group, amongst other things, and is I think the board chair of GBBC. He describes it as the combination of form and function. So form being these advancements in things like XR that have really reshaped the possibilities of us moving beyond what we do in front of a 2D screen, where we're kind of on our own, into something that is more collaborative in a 3D environment. But the other thing that the advancement is, Yorke, where you and I have been working together since 2017, which is with blockchain. And that's the functional aspect of it. So being able to have a secure ID, a payment mechanism. Can you expand a little bit about blockchain's role in what is going on with the development and the evolution of the metaverse?
And I think Mance touched on this a little bit as well, is the evolution of decentralization as a technical implementation that engenders trust and lack of centralized control is a powerful tool when you think about overcoming some of the challenges of the internet, right? And so what we've seen break through from protocol discussions into consumer brands like Nike and Walmart and others is this concept of digital ownership, right? And what digital ownership is. And what's interesting, as many crossing the chasm moments are, is that there's a massive desire, right, for different types of things in different industries, whether it's art or things as simple as a profile picture, or digital handbags or digital shoes or what have you, right, that you can, as a consumer, continue to acquire to adorn on your avatar experience or your social profile. The thing that differentiates that is actually the underlying technology, where you don't have centralized control, and therefore you can establish a root of trust that's trustful, right? And it can't be compromised through, say, takeover, right? Whether it's takeover by a government or a regime, or takeover and controlled by a single enterprise, right? Be it a tech provider, right? Like Microsoft. So in my view, sort of, if you look at the metaverse plus digital ownership and digital goods, they necessitate the combination, right, of the full stack from user experience down through the concept of guaranteed ownership, which includes identity, obviously.
So with that as a tee up then, Mance, can you give some specifics on what are the opportunities for enterprises here?
Yeah, let's make this really concrete and use a use case as an example for exactly what Yorke is talking about. Let's say they're tennis shoes, right? Tennis shoes are are being created. They're, from taking the raw materials, some manufacturer takes the raw materials as goods in, and instead of representing these tennis shoes or these raw materials that are creating the tennis shoes in a database, what they do is they create a token that represents these widgets that are in the supply chain. And then this token flows with the widgets through the supply chain. And at the appropriate moments in time, for example, if you want to get a capital loan for the production of these shoes, this lot of shoes, you could interface programmatically with the new world of decentralized finance in an automated way. The tokens are used to get a capital loan. You use the capital loan to create the product. Then the token associated with the product further in the supply chain process is used for the purchase of product insurance or shipping insurance. Ultimately, the shoes are sold to distributors. When the manufacturer sells the shoes to the distributors, it's shipping with the shoes themselves the tokens that represent those shoes, and gets back in exchange an AR, an accounts receivable, that is also tokenized, by the way. And then that token, that set of tokens that are associated with the ARs, can be factored again in a programmatic way with a bank. And it could be a centralized finance or a decentralized finance opportunity to free up cash flow. But the tokenization of the shoes and the ARs and the financial products, et cetera, along with, and this is where the metaverse, the AR or VR part of it comes in, associated with these individual shoes are the digital representations, the twins, if you will, that people also buy and use in their virtual environments. And they care about this, right? If you have an authentic token associated with your Gucci handbag or your Rolex watch, that means something in a fundamental way. And for the manufacturers, it's fantastic because they can sell these and it's zero margin. I mean, it's 100% margin, zero cost, zero cost of goods, right? COGS are zero and margin is 100% on the tokens that are representative of these consumer products that are being monetized. So what's interesting is that, as Yorke said, the whole tech stack that enables this consists of lots of layers and lots of different parts. And each one of these has been being developed individually and collectively for a lot of years. I mean, we didn't just get here overnight. What's interesting is that the confluence of these things is happening, and it's happening now. And that's what's so exciting. Web 3.0 is going to look very different than Web 1 and Web 2.
So, Yorke, can you expand upon that? Because it sounds like this is a huge opportunity for Microsoft. How are you guys thinking about it, and what are you doing in this space?
Let me actually take a little bit of step back just very briefly as well, because some of my day job work is actually in supply chain, where we actually use tokens for tracing high value commodities in our hardware supply chain. Similar in use case, just not with the consumer conversion example at the end. So absolutely, like, these technologies are in usage today in many, many different use cases. Supply chain happens to be a very good one for a distributed system. And so that's some work that we're already doing there. We also happen to use the same token format in our royalties work in Xbox, where the asset is a little bit more abstract than a piece of physical commodity hardware, but it's the same concept, right? How do you model a supply chain for royalties in an IP-centric gaming world, right? As an example. Specifically in the metaverse, and by the way, I mean, when I say that I believe that the convergence of Web3 and everything else that we're seeing from a user experience is sort of must-have for the metaverse. That's definitely not Microsoft's perspective yet, right? But that's what I'm working on, right? This is the quandary of a very large enterprise technology player, Web 2 player, very specifically. But I think actually Microsoft is very well positioned here because we have a different technology viewpoint than other large Web 2 players. Specifically, we started incubating our decentralized identity work in 2016, which is very specifically focused on public blockchain as a root of trust, right? That gives you those guarantees of identity and ownership, which includes the ability to own and hold crypto assets as well as NFTs. So there's a very natural fit from my perspective on work, to Mance's point, that's been going on, at a very conservative organization like Microsoft for 6 years at this point. So I think that, really fits well. I think where we're seeing the really interesting sort of what brands are doing here is they're looking at the metaverse as an imperative around their brand representation, and also as an opportunity for digital asset sales. So for example, if, what is Nike doing in the metaverse? Why do you see like hats and backpacks and sneakers, right, as part of the stuff that's available from Nike in the metaverse? That's absolutely an opportunity for a digital asset sale. And so digital merchandising and digital merchandise is the way that I think most brands will look at this. And there's a huge sustainability benefit actually there as well, which is, I'd love to talk more about that if we have time. But
now you're speaking my language. So, Mance, what is Hedera doing? I understand that you're working on developing enterprise-ready metaverse applications, but can you kind of talk a little bit more about this? What are you doing in that space?
Sure. Well, so first off, Hedera is a layer 1 protocol. So we use something called Hashgraph, which is an alternative to blockchain. It's proof of stake, not proof of work, which means it's fantastically efficient, energy efficient. In fact, UCL, University College London published a paper comparing us to the other layer 1s, and we're very green relative to the rest of the market in that regard. But we don't, when we say Hedera is doing these things, our council members and other enterprises are building applications on the network. And so the community is using the network to build enterprise applications. Now, there are a lot of examples. Supply chain is a good one. Avery Dennison has a product called atma.io, where everything I just described to you earlier, in fact, it exists, right? And they're using that in the market today. We have council members that care about ESG. EDF is a council member. I mentioned Google, and there are others that have a big focus on ESG. When you think about supply chain use cases generally, and the ESG problem, they go hand in hand. If you can track the costs in terms of energy usage while products are being built, and then at the same time, not just built, but used and consumed, et cetera, the whole life cycle, and at the same time enable energy trading markets. So markets that allow you to trade carbon credits or renewable energy, and the combination of those two, so that as you use energy, you buy the appropriate number of offsets, all integrated into your digital workflow. That's a really big problem, and it's a solution that can be brought to market. ServiceNow, a $130 billion company focused on digital workflows. Another council member of Hedera, doing exactly these kinds of things of integrating the use of DLT into enterprise applications, all focused on the types of problems that we've been describing here.
So break this down a little bit further. And I'm sorry if I'm kind of going back over some covered territory, but when we think about how the rise of a lot of this came out of non-traditional sources, right? So we see a lot of gaming activity that is influencing how we're thinking about this in a collaborative community in a digital world. How are we advising enterprises to start to take this on board? How to start to transition to the metaverse? What does that look like, Yorke? What do you advise them?
Depends on, I think it depends on what, it always goes back to the problem statement, like what are you trying to achieve, right? One of the things that, Satya recently showed in one of his keynotes was this ability to decide how you show up in a Zoom or a Teams chat. Now, it's not all that different than using a snap camera filter, right, which is an AR filter essentially. But Mesh for Teams actually allows you to do that, right? So for example, if you've got an established avatar with gear that you've purchased, you could show up in a Teams call and make a choice, right? So do I show up with a camera? Do I show up in person, or do I show up as an avatar? And actually, we've demonstrated through some surveys that we've done that that's actually quite good if you think about diversity issues and things like that. It gives you another option for how to be quote unquote in present or on camera. There's also lots of different examples. Actually, our HoloLens work has been largely focused on industrial, what I'll call industrial use cases or professional use cases, where you can imagine an immersive environment, whether it's medical or construction or what have you, is quite useful. And I think that's, if you think about the beginning of trying to figure out how to consumerize and commoditize a technology space, that was a good place to start, because you start with bigger, clunkier hardware, and you work your way towards something lighter, softer, more approachable. And I think the same problem exists, frankly, in the VR space, right? Like we could not be sitting on meetings all day long with an Oculus headset on, right? It's just not feasible, right? And so how do you actually help people experience the metaverse, but not have to don a headset and show up in natural places like Zoom or Teams or other? And so when we look at this landscape, we're looking very broadly, right, at this landscape about how do we enable this. So if I were to, for example, be a Web3 advocate and acquire NFTs, I could, right, in theory, actually show up in a Zoom session with my avatar with NFTs that I'm wearing, right, on my avatar, or NFTs that are pictures in the background. There's a lot of space for innovation here. And I think to Mance's point, like there's a convergence happening, and that convergence has really been driven into companies and consumers and professionals based on what we've been experiencing for the last 2 years at this point. And it's a remarkable moment, right, to just see the convergence of technology with the problem statement of the demand, where it's just has to be a normal course of how we do business now.
I love that. So I love the examples that you gave as, kind of starting maybe internally, right? So how are you engaging with the remote workforce? What are you doing with training to kind of make it more engaging? And I think when we've looked at statistics on how people are using, the XR and other capabilities to train, the engagement rates go through the roof. But Mance, what else? Like, so when we think about something like as complex as supply chain, for example, that's not something that you can control within your four walls. So how important is your ecosystem and other factors to get an enterprise to figure out how to really start this process?
Yeah, well, so in our case, it's always been through the creation of a small group of ecosystem partners that and subject matter experts that maybe have no understanding or experience with quote blockchain or distributed ledger technology, but understanding using that to find the low-hanging fruit where there are use cases that have real value. If there are problems that can legitimately be solved through the use of this new type of shared database, where let's just talk about it briefly in this context. This layer one technology, the Web 3.0 decentralized world, depends on a new type of database. Databases historically have assumed that there's one party that's running all of the instances of the database. And what Web 3.0 assumes is the opposite, that you can have a shared database where each instance of that database is managed and controlled by a different party, a different legal entity. Often they're competitive or even unknown to each other. And if you understand it in those terms, then you think about, well, what are the solutions? What are the problems that I can solve with that database? And that comes through ideation and subject matter experts familiar with business problems, and then iterating on prototypes in this ecosystem until you get something that there's, that the ecosystem cares about, and you go to market with it. And so it's a lot of collaborative work across business chains of organizations with companies such as your own. The global system integrators are often involved, and it's always looking for solutions to real business problems that can be solved with this new Web3 category of technology.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, because I think I heard a question I wanted to answer in your question there. If you look at, and Mance sort of went there, is like, it's a collaborative open economy, right? And so if you think about the following use case, it sort of drives you towards, well, it has to be open or it doesn't make sense, right? So I talked about bringing digital assets to my experience today, right? And I'm in a Zoom chat or a Teams chat. How do I do that? And so here's an example of why I think like Web3 is important, and the concept of digital ownership is important and not locked into a walled garden. Is if Nike sells you a digital backpack in a store, and they tell you that you can't leave that store with your digital backpack, and then you want to go into the next store, and in order to take your digital backpack with you into the next store, you have to buy a new one. Well, that is the world of Web2 social media, right? And where Web3 metaverse could wind up, that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, that's not digital ownership, that's renting on a premise, right? And so this concept of digital ownership absolutely has to start at the foundational layer of this understanding that I own my identity, I can acquire and own digital assets that I bring with me, and that I bring with me into any type of experience that I actually walk into.
Can I just piggyback on that? I think
oh yeah, of course.
Really important point. If you look at what happened in Web 1, we started out actually pre-Web 1, we started with walled gardens in the networks. So you'll remember Prodigy and CompuServe, and Microsoft was working on their own walled garden. And there's, of course, a famous story about Bill Gates agonizing over whether to continue with this or to turn the ship 180 degrees and abandon that and go with open standards for the World Wide Web. And of course he did. He made that change, and it ushered in the World Wide Web. That same thing didn't happen in Web 2, right? What happened were the tech giants, the social giants that we're all familiar with, grew up with their own walled gardens around social, and their problems associated with that, because they depend on advertising models. And if they're advertising models, then that means they need to understand everything they can about you as the potential target for the advertising. And it's led to all kinds of privacy problems and the problems that we're all very familiar with. Web3 offers the opportunity to resolve that. It's a collection of technologies, including VR and AR and traditional UI, that makes it possible to create different business models that don't depend on the monetization of your information, and that you control that information. It's yours. And if you want to monetize it, you can. But if you don't, then nobody else has the technical opportunity to do so, right? So it's a change in the way in which the internet works. It's a re-democratization of the internet that is long overdue. And that's part of what makes this whole space so exciting, is that there's an opportunity to make it better for society in ways that need to happen.
I love everything that you just said, and in particular, since you've teed up, I think where we're gonna close off here. So I'm going to ask you both. I'm going to try and narrow focus this a little bit, but also really want your opinions here. So you just touched upon the fact that we've learned, technology advancements have become more and more rapid and more ubiquitous, right? So everybody is kind of participating in them. So with these collaborative innovations that preceded us in this time, and the lessons that we learned from the need for standards, for digital commons, for accessibility and inclusive, design, how can we assure that the promise of the metaverse and that the sustainability, for example, are baked in from the outset? Like, what is that one essential piece of advice that you would give to everybody that's listening today, that that we create a virtual environment that is fair, inclusive, sustainable, et cetera, as we continue to move forward? So Yorke, I'm going to start with you, and Mance, you can wrap us up. But Yorke, what should we be doing?
It's a good question, because there's a lot wrapped up in your question. But
I
would say that I was in Microsoft in 1993 when Bill Gates famously said the internet is a fad. And then 2 years later, in Windows 95, we shipped TCP/IP, right, as the default stack, which was obviously where we are today, right? And we're still running that same stack for all of the e-commerce work that we're doing today. So if I translate what you're saying into, it has to be open, right, for it to be meaningful. And therefore, when you're selling goods in a metaverse e-commerce scenario, you need to be selling goods on a digital domain that's global and not closed. That, to me, drives you towards this concept of Web3 ownership, where the concept of guarantees of ownership that you get from the right type of digital infrastructure at the foundational layer actually supports that. And that's really where NFTs come into play, and where blockchain and public blockchains really play a role. So, I think from that perspective, that also, like the sustainability part of the whole tech story is a very, very long tail conversation. Yeah. So I'm not even going to attempt to drop that in here. But I will say that, if you understand a little bit about what's going on in the blockchain world, as Mance mentioned around proof of stake, most blockchain technologies are moving towards proof of stake because it's a very sustainable protocol. So I'll leave it at that. Thank
you. All right, Mance, take us home.
Just to add just a tad onto that. I agree with all that. The use of standards at the protocol level is what's important. Mm-hmm. When you think about Web 1, what made the World Wide Web what it is was open standards around HTML and other related protocols. That didn't happen with Web 2. And we can go back there. If we think about social in particular, there should be a standard for messaging in the social context. Why is there not an integrated or unified social protocol standard that breaks apart the reliance or the sort of the walled garden of servers that contain all the information with proprietary software clients that are required to be used when accessing that same information? If you break that binding between client software and server software, and you use a unified social protocol, just as an example, this is true in general, then the standards for the protocol are what help us maintain the democratization that we're all looking for.
So many, many rich layers to continue to explore. And certainly Global Blockchain Business Council is really well positioned to help kind of guide some of these conversations and make sure that everybody is at the table. Yorke, Mance, thank you so much for talking me through some of these complexities today. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.